Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the Left Pocket Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. Make sure that you check us out on social media by following @LeftPOC, and that's LEFTPOC. And also to check us out wherever you get your podcasts, of course, iTunes, Spreaker, SoundCloud, etc., etc. And finally, be sure to check out our Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/leftpoc, where everything is free and open to the public, reading materials, outside interviews, etc. But of course, we welcome your donations, which you can do in $1 or more per month increments. Again, that's patreon.com/leftpoc. Anyway, now on with the show. Today we're speaking with Jasson Perez. Jasson Perez is a writer, organizer, and researcher who studies the connections between leftist organizing approaches, political movement formation, policing, incarceration, and economics. He works to create political projects that connect organizing fights for economic, climate, and social justice to the politics of abolition, decolonization, and socialism. He's a revolutionary abolitionist and socialist, and his theory of change is that in the fight for structural reforms through direct action organizing, labor organizing, and electoral organizing, it is possible to create the revolutionary conditions for and the organizational and skill capacity to engage and win in revolutionary struggle. You can find Jasson's writing and research at Dissent, Spectre, Jacobin, the Action Center on Race and Economy, ACRE, and the Cook Center on Social Equity. Before becoming a researcher and writer, Jasson was a lead organizer for the SEIU Local 73 and the Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100. When Jasson isn't selling his labor for sustenance, you can find him subpar rapping with the group BBU and organizing with the DSA Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus, AfroSoc, as well as the Defund CPD campaign in Chicago. And now here's our discussion with Jasson Perez. Hi, Jasson. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And I actually learned about you from Sharice Burden-Selly, who's been on the show several times as a guest. Like, she's an old school guest, but she introduced us. And as sad as this is, like, we wanted to have you on, but I think right now, considering everything going on with police brutality, and I guess I should just say policing, right? Because policing in and of itself is inherently violent and brutal. But with everything going on at the end of, the trial against Derek Chauvin, the continuous murders of children by police, and of Black people, period, I feel like having you on as someone who's working on defunding the police and abolition movements and whatnot was really important and timely. But unfortunately, as I said, this is an ongoing problem. So having you on at any time would have been nice to talk about it, because it's an ever-present issue. But anyway, thank you so much for being here. And I just wanted to start off with you, if you could actually just lay out sort of your your political background, because one of the things that when I was learning a bit about you, I thought was so fascinating was just like your own personal trajectory and how you got into these movements and whatnot. So if you could just talk about what you do and how you ended up doing it for the audience.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you all for your podcast too. It's an amazing podcast. And it was, I remember a time when there was like all these like kind of left or Marxist or just like radical podcasts coming out. And then there were so few that actually, had like a Black, Indigenous, people of color perspective and like focused on not just, Black, Indigenous, people of color, like just like politics, but just like actual like radical traditions and revolutionary movements. So I just, super appreciate that from you. And my own trajectory, I guess, it was kind of basic. I didn't, I grew up working class and middle class on the north side of Chicago. And then, I started getting in trouble a lot. And, by 15, I dropped out. By 16, I was in foster care. And then like by 19, I was like locked up for about 10 months. I think, throughout that time, if you live on the north side of Chicago, it's fairly multiracial. It's like white folks, Latinx folks, black folks. And, and what I learned at that time was that all peoples do drugs and sell drugs, and do dirt and whatever, but, when I started being in foster care and locked up, that's when I saw that it was majority black folks, and at times some Latinx folks, and then no white folks. None of the white folks I'd grown up with were there. And so I think that experience just kind of taught me, okay, maybe there's something systemic going on, because I know a lot of people do messed up stuff, but then they seem to be ending up in different places, and so once I got out, I couldn't get a job anywhere because of like felony disenfranchisement. I didn't really even know what felony disenfranchisement was. And luckily I just, I was in this just jobs program that like, they help you get a job after you get out, and luckily they just, I wasn't getting like jobs at TJ Maxx, like telemarketer things, really basic places. And the person sent me to ACLU. And because they're hiring like an organizing assistant, and she's like, I think they'll do it because like they I think they'll be open to like who you are and your story and things like that. And I think at the ACLU at the time they're going through their like racial white reckoning kind of thing, like we have too many white people or whatever. And that was the first time, the person who's hiring me was like, and it was a black woman who hired me, and she was like, yeah, no, like here we don't believe in that it's okay to discriminate against people because of their felony. And I was like, discriminate? Like I didn't even understand that was being discriminated against, and that getting that job was, I mean, was a lifesaver. I think probably saved me from like, just like going back to like a street life or whatever, like at the time I got the job, when I got the phone call, I was literally putting because back in the day I don't know if people still put flyers on cars, you get paid for it because of like social media, whatever, but I was like putting flyers on cars. And that was from like the day, and I got that from like a day labor gig. You go there, you leave your halfway house, you get there 4:00 in the morning, they like ship you off to wherever parts of the city, so, and I was, and at that point I was like, man, I don't know if I can keep on doing this. I think the minimum wage was like $4.25 an hour or something. And I was just like, this is not the kind of bread I need, And so I got that job, and it was, the check was good, but then I think more importantly, it just introduced me into the world of organizing, introduced me to like Center for Third World Organizing, introduced me to Southwest Youth Collaborative, which was like, they're doing this campaign called the Youth First campaign, which would be like 10% of the city budget always goes to like youth programming and youth job programs, no matter what. And then that taught me like, at some level, it taught me kind of like the anti-Alinsky organizing, in terms of, maybe anti-Alinsky organizing is the wrong word, but, Alinsky organizing was like what currently is the class reductionist type of stuff. Like that's what Alinsky was. It was like class reductionist and like anti-ideological, And so Center for Third World Organizing was just like, no, we should be centered in like radical organizing traditions. We should take class, we should take race, we should take gender all very seriously when we're doing our organizing. And particularly like their coming of age movement was against like all the pushing back against like all the welfare, the anti-welfare bills that were going on at the time. And so I got trained in that, and then I just kind of had the organizing bug since then. And I just wanted to be like a really good organizer. And luckily, I got hired to do community organizing gigs. I did labor organizing for 7 or 8 years, and then I did like abolitionist movement organizing. Helped found BYP 100, and then now I do Afro Socialist of Color Caucus and DSA, and then Defund CPD in Chicago, but then like help build out other defund campaigns across the country, like with like, kind of like a momentum organizing style, but then still like a traditional structure-based organizing style. So, but that's, I guess, that's my story.
Can you talk a little bit about Bate Urbano? Because I know you mentioned before that you did some anti-gentrification work, and if I'm not mistaken, that group does that, right? So can you talk a bit about that? And also, I know that you're of Puerto Rican descent. You're also a Black man. And if you could talk a bit about kind of navigating both Puerto Rican and African American spaces in the work you've done, and what that's looked like for you, especially considering that, you know, like we talk a lot about the kind of rifts or I don't know, like conflicts, if you will, between Afro-Latinos and African Americans, or like quote unquote immigrant Black people and quote unquote native Black people. But I'm curious to know what that's looked like for you on the ground, especially considering that a lot of the organizing that you were doing was about issues that, you know, was detrimental to like both groups. And while you yourself are sort of straddling, at least in appearance, but then also with your name and with the, you know, the communities that you were in, you're kind of dealing with both sides, multiple sides of this. So if you could talk a little bit about that, as well as Bate Urbano, and give us a little info on that as well.
Yeah, Bate was like, it was like, you know, it's connected to the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. And so Puerto Rican Cultural Center obviously has done a lot of work to support Puerto Rican freedom fighters, you know, like Puerto Rican revolutionary, like freedom fighters, and was like birthed out of the context of trying to support Puerto Rican independence. And so, you know, the Bate was like, we wanted to have just a more of a youth run space, because at the time we had the Abiso Campos school, but we wanted a youth run. And by youth, you know, we mean like, you know, like early teens all the way up to like 30s, you know, or like our mid 30s, like that was running like that we could run, and that community members felt like they could run. Because, you know, you always have that, you don't always, but a lot of times you have the dynamic of, you know, folks who are either more college educated or kind of like in that in-between space, but then wanting to work with and build with folks who, you know, I mean, basically like hood life is mainly what they know, you know. And so trying to do that in a way that's actually democratic, that's actually not like fetishizing like either side of things, and that and isn't tokenizing, you know. So Bate Urbano was basically, we had poetry night on Thursday night, we had hip hop on Friday night, and then we had political education on Saturday night. You know, the folks from the community would run the space itself, you know. We had like a little council, like where we'd meet once a week to like run things, like to clean the space, to make sure like the programs are running. And then we also, and a brother named Michael Rodriguez Munez was like one of the lead folks, who I think he's a sociologist out of Northwestern now. You know, he helped build out then the Participatory Democracy Project, which was then, you know, a traditional like door knocking operation but it was, you know, it was to do, you know, more of like a different form of electoral organizing, more in like the tradition of like what Cooperation Jackson like for a while did, in terms of wanting to make sure that like people are like have their services met, can organize around other projects outside of just like strictly like, you know, like the Democratic Party like type organizing, you know. So that was the idea of Bate Urbano. And I think, at least for me, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center was the first. It was my experience with, you know, and at the time my mentor was Jose Lopez, who's you know, brothers of Oscar Lopez, who's who's a Puerto Rican political prisoner, and you know, and he really pushed me on the idea that like even any kind of like revolutionary strategy needs to have some semblance of electoral strategy. It has to, you know, and it has to like think through that, and it has to move through that like that we can't just rely on just like a non-electoral approach or just an insurrectionary approach. And he kind of always just like broke that down to me, like, you have to have labor, you have to have electoral, you have to have direct action, and then you have to have some level of direct services, but then still, you know, grounded in some level of like a revolutionary or radical or progressive ideology and praxis. So because before then I was like, you know, reading tons of Panther books, reading tons of Young Lords books, and I was like, you know, electoral politics is bullshit. Why are we doing this and this and the other thing? And so, and you know, he could walk me through every political prisoner, every Puerto Rican political prisoner, and explain how that connected to an electoral strategy, right? He could walk me through how the bombing of Vieques connected to, now you still had to have a direct action component, you still had to have a bunch of other things, but that like how these things in Puerto Rican politics connected directly to having some semblance of an electoral strategy. So, yeah, that was probably a pretty big moment for me on that level. On the level of, around race and nationality, I think it was, there were some real like hardcore moments where it was just like, like non-Black Puerto Rican folks saying, saying nigga like it ain't nothing, and being like, yo, like that's got to stop, and folks who are either Black Puerto Rican or folks who are just Black folks being like, no, that's not cool. Like there was a moment where folks were like, oh, well, we should knock on Black doors, folks, because like we're here to like talk to and build with Puerto Rican folks. And like, some of us had to push back and be like, no, that's not cool at all. Like that's not. So it was definitely a lot of moments where you would have to deal with anti-Blackness in that kind of way. And sometimes not it's anti-Blackness. It's just like, I don't know, maybe it is anti-Blackness, but it's just like this, I don't know if misunderstanding is the right word, but you just had to push back on it a lot of times. And I think, at a certain level, at least for myself, I was just like, I just don't want to be in a place where I have to like justify myself or like, justify like the politics of Black liberation and having to explain it like that. And I think the more you learn that like, oh, there's a whole bunch of Black folks in Puerto Rico or Black folks who are Puerto Rican who feel this way also, I felt less, at least for myself, I felt less estranged from that and just like letting myself be okay with like, my job is to focus on Black folks, locally and globally and Black liberation on that level. And that like, I believe that then that will connect in a meaningful way to like Puerto Rican struggle and like, and Puerto Rican liberation also.
That's interesting because, like I said, there have been, I think sometimes there's a moment of like talking past one another. And I even think like lately I've been listening a lot to, I've been really getting into Frank Wilderson's work on Afro-pessimism. But, one of the criticisms that I have of some of his commentary, although I certainly can empathize with it, is he seems to sort of foreclose on, cross-cultural organizing in some ways. And even sometimes it feels like, I mean, or I shouldn't say he forecloses on it, but he's basically just like, it's not going to work. Like, it's like you can try all that. That's nice. That's cute, whatever. But it's just a stopgap measure. And at the end of the day, like, anti-Blackness is sort of the rubric around which all these other groups operate to define themselves and exist. It's like their lifeblood. And I think that, in some ways, as salient and I think like very identifiable a lot of his commentary is, I think what ends up falling out of the bottom of it is like how if you can like deprogram the white supremacy from these other groups, if you can work toward that, there may be some opportunity there for actual solidarity. And I think that some of his work is like so hard hitting and so realism based that it's like, no, that's not going to happen, but that's cute, So I appreciate that you were working through those issues on your own and kind of trying to recognize the ways that, different communities were engaging in anti-Blackness, but how there was also an opening through which you yourself fit in, not with the anti-Blackness, but with the organizing, that you could make way, with different groups. And as I said, yourself sort of on the ethnic lines, at least straddling multiple groups, especially in a place like Chicago. And that makes me think, as a segue, of course, of your work with DSA. So I know you mentioned that you work with, or you continue to work with AfroSoc, and I've talked to and met a lot of people. I've even done an event for AfroSoc, and I really appreciate a lot of the work they do. And I also very much recognize that they're constantly dealing with a bunch of bullshit. Like so many people are very negative about them, including people who claim to be their comrades. So I was wondering if you could also talk a bit about that and what it's been like, organizing within greater DSA. And we can talk a little bit more about the abolition stuff in a moment. So I just mean generally speaking, right? What's been your organizing experience with them, especially because you have so many people who are new to organizing that are coming in through DSA and approaching it through that organization. But then even more particularly, what has your experience been organizing through AfroSoc and trying to do, as you said, some electoral outreach alongside the organizing and dealing with, I don't know, like drama from all sides and like arrows coming from all directions.
Yeah. No, yeah, I appreciate that. Oh, and just on the Frank piece, like, I mean, because I have a lot of homies who are just like, how are you like an Afro pessimist? And I don't take on Afro pessimism as like an identity, but like I believe it's really important scholarship that everyone should care about and not dismiss. And I feel like, I think while I was pulled to it too, it was like the first scholarship that I read that actually spoke to my experiences, especially just as like most of my foundational racist experiences happen from other people of color, right? Happen from non-Black Latinx folks, and non-Black Puerto Rican folks in particular. And at least for me, Afro-pessimism was the first thing to really kind of speak to that, give me a theoretical frame for it and understanding for it, like for sure. I think Frank, just like a lot of scholars usually do, like just because something is like epistemically true, or true at the level of ontology or theory doesn't mean that it's, strategically, or empirically true in terms of like, how do you actually build an organizing project, and that's always been my difference on it. And solidarity is, I mean, just like with class, we want to move from a class in and of itself, like the class that's made by like our working relations, to a class for itself, which is a radical political class that can fight for its ends. And I look at it the same way with like stuff in regards to like in regards to race, like just because we are going to have conflict or antagonisms between each other, but the point of solidarity is to recognize that, know that we're not necessarily seeing eye to eye, and that we might even do like fucked up stuff to each other, but then be able to figure out ways to meaningfully organize. Like, I don't believe in solidarity that assumes that like, I have to have the right answer or say all the right things in A, B, or C. It just means that, I'm willing to, be vulnerable and do the work in order to like make the collaboration effective, and then of course be accountable if I do like messed up or fucked up stuff, and so, and I mean, for DSA, that's, I think that's kind of like the spirit I walked into DSA with. I think there's like a certain amount of folks who kind of look to like their political organizing to be kind of like their home, and like their safe place. And for sure it can be your political home, but I think it's a political home. It's not necessarily a therapeutic home, and so that's how I walked into DSA with, and I was interested just in being in a much bigger organization, like, DSA is around 100,000 folks, and like with at least 30,000 people who are active, in the work. And that part was exciting to me, and it still is exciting to me. DSA at the level of, in terms of kind of like what you read about in books of like kind of big organizations like the Communist Party, or like, earlier parties back in the day is, or even NAACP at its height is, that's how DSA is, like that's how active it is in terms of, and it's mostly volunteer run. It's not staff run, it's dues run. It's not like funders driven. So that part is amazing, actually. And then the different political caucuses, right? You have like communist caucuses, you have, people who are more electoralists, people who are more like anarchists, it's all different types of varieties, which I appreciate too. Its problem is the amount of white people it has, and the amount of white people it has who think they know everything. And that part is, I don't know if it's tiring. I think the nice thing about DSA versus other organizing things I've been in that are multiracial, let's say labor, is that you have genuine avenues to win real power and to control the organization and put it in a direction you want to. So, which is then explains the birth of AfroSoc Caucus. And with AfroSoc Caucus, we could make sure reparations was front and center. We can make sure that there was like a real not real, but an anti-imperialism committee that actually reflects the political traditions that come from the global South and perspectives of the global South, and then that I think that matters. And I think that no matter what, when we're trying to, make sure an organization like has a genuine racial justice project, has a genuine, is genuinely committed to like multiracial organizing, different people have different approaches to that. And I think, you should have some semblance of a democratic system and a political process to win that political argument. I think in my time in other organizations that were more nonprofit based or like more traditional nonprofit based, there's not really those avenues, and it's really staff driven. And then you still have like the fights around people who, like, let's say, don't want to do any electoral stuff, or who only want to do only want to do electoral stuff, or understand abolition in this way or abolition in that way. And there's no democratic space to like deliberate what those differences are and then still come to a decision. And also like for people to like form different caucuses and have those fights and then have to convince their members and their peers of like, like, I think we should follow this way or that way. And so I appreciate that part of DSA, and I appreciate that part of like what we've been able to do with AfroSoc in terms of like, making sure, our the Black members in DSA, the Indigenous and people of color members of DSA aren't taken over by like fuck shit from white folks, And so I definitely sympathize with people who are like, hey, I don't want to deal with that. And, for everybody that's not their ministry, but, I'm also glad that, we don't do, kind of like the surge, like the surge kind of aspect of it of like, white people, you got to teach yourselves this, or, or even like who's that dude who does all that anti-racism stuff, the Ibram, whatever.
Ibram X. Kendi.
Yeah. Like like we don't walk into it like we need to explain y'all what we don't walk in with that energy too. We're just like, it's like, this is a political fight. We got the votes. We about to make this happen. Woo wop shabam. Like it's based on that. So it's not like this kind of managerial or like this like pedagogy, like if we just get the right pedagogy, like no, that's not what we are interested in and fighting on. And and I think sometimes people don't quite realize like how many Black people DSA has, like it's like it's around, we don't have official numbers, right, but it's like around 8,000 10,000 Black folks, right, which is pretty big for even any other type of organization. So if you organize yourselves, you get some level of clarity of how you want to move forward. Understanding that we all have different political tendencies and political beliefs, like you have the Black folks who somehow always agree with, all the class reductionist white socialists, and who get mad at AfroSoc for, making a statement against anti-Blackness. And then you have some Black folks who feel like we're not going hard enough, and that we need to be, maybe more Maoist about it or more Pan-Africanist about it or whatever, and so, you're trying to always figure that out, but you do it democratically and politically. And then I think to me, for some people makes to me, it's far healthier than I think some of the organizing that I was involved in, like post Ferguson, or even at the time in like with Vitale and those kind of spaces where it's very much like you have to follow one line, or you're trying to figure out one political line, and then that is the line, and then that's how we get free, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely have some more questions about the opponents to AfroSoc that I'll ask you about a little bit later. But Richard, I wanted to get you in to see if you had any questions for Jasson thus far.
I certainly share some of the curiosities that you're alluding to, but I guess, excuse me, one of the things that I was curious about from what I had heard is you mentioned the electoral aspect, and some of the things that I read in some of the pieces that we looked over before recording was about local organizing and that aspect of the electoral kind of branch of this multi-pronged strategy that you describe. And I was curious if you could speak a bit more about how, because I think when people think of electoralism, they're often thinking of the presidency and other national positions, how kind of the local aspect can be a powerful tool, both towards specifically abolition, defunding, but also towards political organizing.
Yeah, I mean, at least for me, especially when you're getting, when we have these kind of movement moments, you get so many people in, and there's kind of like very few avenues where you can have a good trained disciplined organizing program where people can get a lot of good basic organizing skills, like how do you list build, how do you have a good door knocking conversation, how do you know when you're at a low point in a campaign, a high point, a midpoint, how do you know when you need to start escalating in terms of how you're canvassing or bringing people out for it, like electoral campaigns, just as like if you unfortunately I'm really into sports, right? So but it's a contained thing that allows you to know if you won or you lost and like what your progress is, unlike sometimes maybe more like direct action campaigns or like movement moment kind of campaigns, which are the ebb and flow, and at times it's really hard to tell if you've won or lost, or like there's not as tight of a schedule. So at least on that level, electoral campaigns are really like good like organizing training programs on the ground. I think on the ideological level and policy level, I think we have the benefit of a lot, and especially in like more bluer areas, usually they don't have partisan elections, and also too, not unfortunately, but Democrats believe in voter suppression just as much as Republicans, but just in different ways,
Mm-hmm.
and so that is it's an opportunity for folks to, I think, understand the power of the ballot box if it's used towards radical ends. I think a lot of times people, do the rightful critique of black faces in high places, and that didn't work, and And I think that critique is correct. I think what it misses is that like it was a strategy based on the idea that you wouldn't have, I think where black politics was at that time, especially like post 68, was still that if you said black power, or if you said, I was a black person running this, day, and the other thing, you had to have fairly radical positions, right? The Congressional Black Caucus in the 70s is to the left of what Bernie Sanders is now, right? So, and obviously that faded with like the time of neoliberalism. So I think if you have an explicitly like socialist running, right, or like let's say an abolitionist running, or even someone who's like, let's say they said their thing is like decolonization or whatever, right? I think you can have radical politics and people running as radicals as we've done in Chicago, right? We had 6 explicit socialists who ran, and then one of them got kicked out of DSA in the Socialist Caucus because they voted with the mayor, and like they're doing the thing that politicians do, right? So, but you can have that space to run folks who have an explicit radical politics and are dedicated to radical politics, and then are less, and in my opinion, I think have the institutional ability to not have to be dependent on even like kind of progressive world war and world type democratic politics, and can build their own political operations. So in Chicago, most of our socialist aldermen have things called independent political organizations, IPOs, and that's who like those elected officials are accountable to, and that's how they're able to like to build out their base and the power that we need. Now that's not to say it's all, for the most part, DSA and other radical groups, we have some power to hold them accountable, but we can't. There is going to be that power imbalance, and I don't think we should be. I don't think we should run from that, right? We should say like, this is a risky thing, and we'll see where it goes, but, at least for me, my theory of change runs that if we're able to get more explicitly radicals, right? People who either claim like, hey, I'm a socialist, hey, I'm an abolitionist, and then are attached to said socialist or whatever radical organization, right? Similar to the woman in Seattle, then I think we can start building out the conditions that made something like the New Deal and, and the organizing Asa Philip Randolph did possible, because those were moments where we also had a very different electoral map, where there was dozens of independent parties or independent factions who were running for office too, both nationally and locally. Beyond that, I don't know what it means or doesn't mean at the federal level in terms of like presidential level, I don't have that many answers for us. I just think that, getting more socialists elected, getting more radicals elected at a local and state level, and even federal level, like not non-presidential, I think gives us better power when we're trying to do labor organizing, when we're trying to do direct action organizing, when we're trying to do mutual aid work or building out alternatives. But I think we should also listen to the lessons from Jackson, and like what Cooperation Jackson says and what Kali says in terms of the times to run folks, the times not to run folks. What does it mean when you want to be managing austerity or not managing austerity, and, and I think especially the lesson that Kali said that, like, they shouldn't have ran a mayor, they should have just ran for folks for council seats, I think is a good lesson, especially in a time of austerity. You don't want to be the one managing austerity because there's no good choices to make. And even someone like Mike Davis says that. So, but I think I'll also say electoral organizing, I feel like, has brought more folks in the left and more like Black folks, Latinx folks into the left, and into a more, and into a left that doesn't fall then into like ultra radicalism of like, have to be more radical than the next person. And also one that actually makes sense to people, that is of Black and working class folks. Like we have someone like Jeanette Taylor in the 20th Ward on the South Side, who, these aren't just folks who are just like, these aren't like the usual group of folks who, like, you think would say that they're socialist or that they're leftist or whatever, and when they first came into this didn't identify as that, but grew into that. And that's the kind of folks that's the kind of organizing we want to do. We just don't want people who are self-identified radicals or socialists or communists to be in this work. We want to grow, we want to grow that base and grow that out for folks.
No, thank you for that. And I think the point that you make about how electoral politics has often been a way to get a lot of people into it, and then having an organization where you can help build and understand and learn the skills of organizing the types of things that you're talking about at the local level is a critical component of that. And so while I find myself generally skeptical of the electoral landscape, broadly speaking, I can see the argument you're making there. And I think it's a very valuable one that those that would find themselves more skeptical of electoralism like myself, I think should value.
Yeah, and to like the, because there's this thing, because I talked to, because I have some friends in like Black Alliance, and they're like, and they on some like, fuck all that shit, which is rightfully so. And I think, a lot of things that people started doing around Biden was like, well, if he doesn't do it, we'll hold him accountable. And it's just like, we don't have any power to hold him accountable. Like, we should not be saying that to people. Like, we shouldn't even be saying it like that it's harm reduction, right? Like, at best, all we can just say is that it's not Trump, and and we should be like, that's not a great argument, like, we should, like, it shouldn't be, and I mean, for DSA, we didn't endorse Biden, and we wouldn't, even though some people were pushing for that, oddly. But yeah, I think sometimes like, electoral leftist folks, like, we just kind of push that like a little bit too much. And to be clear though, I'm always on the direct action side first and foremost. I believe direct action, disruptive power, animates all those things. It's just that sometimes it's episodic and it has ups and downs. And so we need something that kind of gets us through like the lean times. And in terms of like a training program and a good regimen program. And I think electoral organizing allows that while allowing for, at times substantial wins, and then also preventing substantial losses. And like by wins is like, I think, like the defund work that happened in Austin, the defund work that happened in Seattle. I don't understand how that happens without having explicit, like, radical and progressive electoral organizing at the time, so that then, you could get the type of cuts in policing, and then type of investments in community programs that you got. That wasn't just all disruption, and so, yeah.
Yeah, emotionally, I find myself in the, fuck all that camp, but then also strategically, I see the value. And so, like, I try, and like you mentioned, some of the kind of the frustration I think Wendy wanted to talk about too, but when working in those organizational spaces with some of the folks that are, as you mentioned, so I'll pass that to Wendy, I think.
All right, yeah.
That's a perfect segue. Thanks, guys. So I want to get into a lot of stuff that you talked about. So I was like taking notes furiously because I didn't want to forget. My memory is really weak, so I didn't want to forget to touch on it later. I do want to talk about Chicago politics a lot, especially with regard to policing and the mayors in both the last two cases just being shit-tastic on it, but expectedly so, I think. But then we'll get to that later. I also want to get to abolition work, obviously, and defund. But I also, first and foremost, just want to handle a bit of stuff on the gossip circuit and try to figure out what happened. And when I say gossip circuit, I'm joking and just referring to like DSA drama. But
Nice.
you know, I remember in 2020, one of the big things that I heard about, at least sort of through the grapevine, was that there were tensions with regard to AfroSoc and some of the demands that you all had raised with regard to, like, you know, Bernie Sanders or any presidential candidate that you all were going to endorse. You had a list of demands. You can, you know, obviously work through clarifying the names of things and whatnot if you wish. But I recall that reparations was one of the concerns on the list, or demands on the list. And you had several, you know, you all had several others as well that Bernie Sanders didn't necessarily meet. And yet the DSA was pushed seemingly ignored some of those demands in order to endorse him, I would argue a bit prematurely. I could be wrong though. So I'm curious if you could talk about that episode, if you had any sort of insight on what happened there. And then also just like, some of the challenges that, because I know you mentioned earlier that like some white people in DSA are on some fuck shit, and that's totally legitimate. But I'm also, because you've written about this, I'm also curious to know your thoughts on, you know, what I would jokingly say are there Black, Indigenous, and people of color allies in that struggle against what seems like any semblance of acknowledgement or attempts to eradicate racism. So if you could talk a bit about that and what some of the challenges are there as well. And then I'll flip into talking about the really deep stuff that we had you want to talk about in the first place.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, you know, I think actually it was that letter about Bernie that AfroSoc sent that then said, like, let me get serious about DSA and AfroSoc, because I think at first I was on the fence about DSA, you know, because I went to like my first DSA meeting and it was all, you know, it was like 95% white folks, you know, which is jarring. You know, it's jarring to be like in a city like Chicago, and like it's hard, you know, it's really hard to have any sort of progressive or leftist space in the city of Chicago that's that white, you know, like you have to go out of your way because it's like a city, you know, it's not like you're in some sort of farm town or whatever, you know, where it might be, you know, more white folks and stuff like that.
Well, wait, sorry, let me interrupt you really quick. My bad. Where did they hold the meetings? Because the issue here in Baltimore, because they have the same problem here in Baltimore, it's like Baltimore is like 990% Black, and then the DSA is very white, but they hold their meetings up at Hopkins. And they don't hold them in, you know, West Baltimore or in the quote unquote hood. So I'm curious to know if they have like a spatial or geographic issue that they're working with in their DSA too.
Well, yeah, they definitely have a geographic issue in terms of like, it being more north side-ish. But like the where we meet is like in the center of the city, you know, by downtown, but like in like the Union, like we have like a Union kind of corridor. And we're at the United Electrical Union Hall. So, I mean, I think I think, honestly, if we had ours in the south side of Chicago, like wherever, it would still be, I think, that many white. Well, maybe not. Yeah, maybe not. But no, because we've had ones right in Bronzeville. We've had DSA meetings in Bronzeville because it's the south side chapter branch, and it's still like way too many white folks. It's just DSA itself, you know. That's what it is. So you know, that threw me off, you know, and I was just like, I don't know if I want to deal with just that much white nonsense. But then after seeing that letter, I was like, okay, this is dope, you know. And you know, and the letter was like reparations, but then also race specific policies, right? Specifically racial justice policies, and not just dressing up your like your other policies as like the racial justice policies, right? You know, there was a faction of folks who were really against it. The MPC, our National Political Committee, still voted yes for it. To do the endorsement. And what we weren't like saying like, you know, Sanders, you need to do every single one of these things. But it was just like, if you want our endorsement, you need to have a conversation about this and be moved on some of it, you know. And there was, within the leadership at the time, there was no desire to do that, you know. And so you know, we lost that political fight. I think what came about of it was like the real nationalizing of AfroSoc, you know, and then an AfroSoc convention. And, we kind of have the AfroSoc that we have today from that moment. I think the next go round when a fight like that happens, I think we'll be in a better position to win it. And I think we've moved a lot of our comrades on that, but I guess you never know until the moment happens, right? How much power you actually have when the vote comes down. So, and, there is folks in DSA who believe that we are, I guess like a sectarian caucus, and that like we're preventing people of color from like understanding how great DSA is, or like not bringing people into DSA, or you hear a lot of weird stuff from folks about it, and I think there's kind of like a politics or a preference of like folks who just want to focus in on all that, and I'm just like, I really don't care, I see what the work is that we do, I see folks who come into AfroSoc and then go into DSA, and then help build out DSA into something better, so that it's a genuine it's a genuine socialist space that takes BIPOC political orientations seriously and moves on those. That's I think the story of how defund and abolition work got so important within DSA, and we're gonna always have those fights. We're in the middle of that kind of political fight, but every kind of genuine moment when kind of like the class reductionist faction can, really, really put its teeth down and try to either eliminate us, Adolph Reed came out against our caucus, and went on several podcasts saying that we're going to be the downfall of DSA, but then the DSA general membership voted for yes to our caucus. Adolph Reed tried to do a talk being race doesn't matter. We shouldn't focus on racial disparities. Right after George Floyd got killed, and we said that we don't want Adolph Reed talking in our organization anymore, especially having a national platform in our organization. And all we said was, hey, we want to debate Adolph Reed, and he said no to that. And then Adolph Reed stopped speaking, and they try to paint it into that we wouldn't let him speak or whatever. But I think at some level, we're winning these political fights. I'm obviously sympathetic to folks who say, well, you shouldn't even have to have those political fights in the first place. I hear that. Maybe if Adolph Reed was white, then maybe I would maybe look at it differently. I think a lot of the things that we see with racism, with sexism, with any of these kind of things that happen within organizations, outside of course, very real instances of, either direct racial, direct racial abuse, or for sure, sexual violence, right? Things like that. But in terms of more of its political manifestations, what people call microaggressions manifestations, I think need political solutions in terms of debating, bringing other people onto your side, and then winning that fight, that political fight, like we did with having Reed not speak at an event, so.
Yeah, I remember when that was happening, a lot of people framed, well, not a lot of people, but people in the very vocal, but super loud, but often wrong online left media, they were very negative about it and basically framed it as a case of cancel culture, which is another obsession of theirs. That's yes. It's just right wing ideological laundering. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's definitely something that's straight out of the right wing, and that because they tend to engage a lot of right wing thinkers themselves, or even some of them are arguably wolves in sheep's clothing themselves. They launder these ideas and bring them to the left and try to legitimize them, and then sometimes try to frame them as left. When people say, oh no, but being against Palestinian activists and whatnot is cancel culture. And it's no, honey, that's capitalism. That's colonialism. What are you talking about? What are you talking? That means that you're missing the forest for the trees if you think cancel culture is the problem and not capitalism and imperialism and whatnot. But anyway, that aside, I think that still sort of opens up the space to talk a lot about the abolition work, because that's another area that I've seen a lot of online leftists, and particularly white leftists that are vocal in these spaces, fail. There has been from the jump. I mean, I remember last year there was a constant nitpicking about oh, these people aren't protesting right, or they're not talking about class enough, or this. I'm like, why don't you get in the streets with them then? Instead of like sitting behind your computers or whatever, why don't you go why don't you go talk to some of them? Because, you know, they're afraid of Black people. They're afraid to touch, you know, issues that affect Black people. And there's a certain chauvinism or myopia around issues that affect Black people that are directly tied, I would argue, and many others before me have argued, that are also tied to economic issues. And police brutality is also an economic issue. And, you know, it's about foreclosing, corralling, and protecting private property and the people who are its possessors. You know what I mean? Like there's no other way around this. And there's also obviously a racist component in the United States and among many other countries, right? So I think what's odd is that they just kind of abdicated their responsibility to I would argue, a large portion of the Black community that deals with these issues on a regular basis, and Indigenous and Latino people as well. When I say Black, in this case, I'm meaning African American, but certainly from other communities too. So I just, you know, that part was frustrating to watch. And it continues into the present. So a full year after the George Floyd protests, there's still so much hand-wringing over, well, should we call it abolition? Should we call it defund? Defund doesn't work. That's going to scare away people. And I'm like, if you're afraid of frightening capitalists, you probably shouldn't be a socialist. Like, you might want to rethink your political ideology if you're afraid of offending people with politics that will help people. You know what I'm saying? It just doesn't make any sense. And that seems to have animated so much of this nonsense. I hear so much coming up, like, it doesn't poll well. Well, nor did Medicare for All until you worked toward advocacy on it, right? Nor did so many other things, nor did, you know, not going into the Vietnam War or going into Iraq or filming any sort of issue that you want to change people's minds on, you have to work toward. I mean, we're going up against a hyper-capitalist system and hundreds of years of brainwashing on so many issues, right? So of course people aren't going to embrace it right away, but you have to expose people to things, and you have to talk to them, and you have to explain. That should, you know, undermine, from the way I understand left politics, that's like a crucial part of it. So in recognizing that reluctance, how did you first come upon abolitionist theory? I know you mentioned some interest in Afro-pessimism, things like that, and a lot of people who are Afro-pessimists are also happen to be abolitionists. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that, your entree into that set of politics, and then also just like how you think that people who are abolitionists should go forward in working to convince people, or to have people understand, how the system operates, especially if they themselves are not reflected as its victims, at least in the same way that we're used to seeing, Black and Latino, like Black people, period, in this country, being terrorized by the state, right? If you don't see yourself being terrorized every day, all day long on via social media and the television, how do you get those people to be invested in abolition? And yeah, so if you could explain that a bit, and explain what abolitionism is, how you found your way into it, and how we can work towards getting more people to recognize its validity and salience in the society.
For first, just in terms of like the small group that's very loud online that then somehow represents all of, I think, socialism, and or certainly what DSA is, I think, that's always the thing that surprised me the most about DSA. It's just like, it is what most people think it is. It's just a small online group. And, whenever they try to have sway within DSA, proper, for the most part, it fails, like they don't. And part of usually why then they usually either leave DSA or they're not like involved in DSA, like the Chapo folks, and even like a lot of the folks who are like affiliated with just kind of like that aspect of it. They don't stay because, we are truly like a democratic, deliberative organization, and you have to like win the fight amongst folks on that. And you can even see that with folks like Megan Day right now trying to push back on defund and abolition. And and it's folks from DSA lining her up also. I mean, it's Black folks and other folks lining her up, but it's folks in DSA being like, nah, that ain't it. And like when it comes to like voting on what we're going to do and how we're going to move forward, defund and abolition stuff wins and has won even before this big moment for abolition, right? It even won in 2017 when motherfuckers in DSA who are arguing it's okay for cops to be in DSA, that type of shit. So, and luckily that vote lost. So, I mean, I think, for me, I came to abolition I think because of my time being incarcerated, doing various mass, anti-mass incarceration work. And, I think being introduced to the ideas of George Jackson, Angela Davis, Joy James, and then, of course, Mariame Kaba, luckily, I got to be in the same city as Mariame Kaba. I got to be, there when we started We Charge Genocide, when we were doing the reparations work for the prison, for the torture survivors, the John Birch torture survivors. So, who were made to do false confessions. And I think how I understood it, how it was explained to me, and then also Kathy Cohen, Barbara Ransby, Beth Ritchie, was just that this is a continuation of the political tradition that started with us of abolition, not abolition in terms of the liberal interpretation of abolition, but abolition in terms of the things that folks in Haiti did, in order to get free from slavery, the things that we did as Black people in the Americas, or in in Americas, in the broadest sense, in order to get free. And that my understanding of it is that, there's kind of the Black radical tradition as defined by, Cedric Robinson. But even for that, I to me, that's still a little too ontological to she kind of falls into a cosmology, which I'm not against cosmology. I'm a spiritual person. I wake up, I pray. At night, I pray. I go to I have a spiritual program I'm a part of and all that in community. But, I identify the Black radical tradition far more as the things that Black people did in order to get free against slavery versus the ideologies and cosmologies behind them. And to me, then that is our own radical tradition, that I think complements and intersects with socialism and decolonization and anti-colonial struggles, and for sure is based on, feminist and queer politics, but is its own political project. And I think from there, I just, with doing the work with BYP 100, it was just figuring out how to build that out in terms of an actual mass movement organizations that can take on police power directly. I think especially before the post-Ferguson moment, a lot of police accountability work would still just target elected officials, and it didn't target police stations, jails, prisons, and so it was just the idea of no, we need to start shutting down police stations. We need to start surrounding police cars. We need to start de-arresting folks when we're at protests. And it was just a different orientation of making not police accountability the object, the thing to go after, but police themselves the thing to go after. And that's the problem of the force that's curtailing working class folks, especially working class Black folks' ability to organize and to sustain the organizing too, right, is the size and scope of the police force that we have in this country. And I think globally also that's what the police is there for. I mean, they're there for multiple different things, but they're, paradigmatically there in order to curtail leftist, radical and revolutionary and even progressive projects to that seek emancipation, right? So they police serve, their narrating voice in something like Selma, right, which is still a liberal kind of piece, and presents itself as kind of this liberal progressive thing, certainly not radical revolutionary. And the groups involved at that time weren't necessarily in their radical revolutionary phase yet. SNCC was beginning to, but they were still, the main narrator is the FBI, and that's the force that we have to take on if we want to be able to have the space needed in order to organize in the ways that we need to in order to get the level of freedom that we want, whether your vision is socialism, anarchism, communism, whatever your ideological orientation is. And so I think that's what brought me to abolition. When people say that, it's kind of odd, or, like the critiques of like, well, if people say that about socialism, right? And by people, usually I'm referring to like Black folks, right? Black folks say that about socialism also. And that's fine. Like my job as an abolitionist is to meet people where they're at, but then still be clear about like what my principles and what my politics are, and show them that like, that I have like a valid theory of change and approach to a new society that they can see themselves in. And even if they don't agree with me, they'll still want to ride along on part of the programs and the things that I'm saying, right? Like that's what Stokely was doing in relation to Fannie Lou Hamer, like that's what all good organizers do. And yeah, I feel like especially like when it's coming from kind of like more of like the white left or and the white socialist left of like, people to associate defund with abolition too much. I was just like, well, they're saying the same thing about Sanders. And, I'm a Sanders person, like they're saying the same thing about Sanders, like especially the Warren folks. Like, would that mean then Sanders should stop saying he's a socialist, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, no one would ever say that it's important to like have these kind of ideological interventions, because usually that's the only way we can speak against capitalism in really explicit ways, is through our radical politics, but trying to not make it like cult-like and like dogmatic, And so, I don't, you said it, you said it better than even I have. It's just like, join the organizations and just do the work, and all types of organizations are doing it, like Working Families Party, Democratic Socialists of America, obviously Movement for Black Lives. There's definitely anarchist organizations. Like there's tons of folks doing like abolitionist or defund work that you can join and make it happen and figure it out. It's not that deep. I think the other thing too is just like, like nowadays people are saying like, oh, like people support divest invest at 68%. Like I'm just like, yo, like people wouldn't support divest invest at 68% if like defund wasn't like on their throats, like all of a sudden people want to like, take on the thing that like sounds more lighter or sounds more cool or whatever, when they're faced with something like defund and as polemical as defund, and that's just, that's basic. People wanted to do more of the things certain things that King was talking about the minute Black Power came online, So, I at times I'm just like, I don't know. At times I just really don't know what people are trying to get at outside of just like, maybe they're just trying to like sound like they have a hot take or something like that. I don't really know.
Yeah, as I said, it feels entirely incongruent, because if you're talking about especially the U.S. prison system, right? It's as I said, it's hyper-capitalist. It literally exists in order to, it's a form of foreclosure. It's not just like, if we're talking about Marx, right? Like you're literally, it's like the first chapter in Vitale or whatever, where they're talking about this process of removing people from the land. You're criminalizing people for doing things that they normally do, for having access to their own spaces. And people are being criminalized for existing, and that's a perfect example of it. And you also have analyses that came later, where we're talking about surplus population and all these things, and how these groups are corralled, killed, and housed, and then forced to engage in labor and whatnot, because the normal traditional labor force or the labor source is no longer there, right? So, all these things go back to very basic Marxist and communist principles, and yet people are still hand-wringing over it. And I think the very glaring reason for that is because it relates to Black people. Like I don't, I'm just playing it plain like that. That's why, because I think if we saw, I'm just being honest. Like I think if we saw white people being murdered and arrested at the same rate as Black, Latino, and Indigenous people are in this country, I don't think we'd be sitting here and having this conversation right now about people hand-wringing over it. I don't think it would exist, right? Every day, Jacobin or some other, prominent left organization, publication, and webpage or media source would be talking about how we need to defund the police because look at what they're doing to the working class.
Yeah.
But that they're not going to, no one's going to come out and say it. But I think in some ways their language and approach to this, their critique, supposed critique, which is often, it's one that falls short and falls flat, is a matter of racism. And they just, I don't think they're being honest with themselves about that, or they're trying to dress it up, but it's coming across a lot like dog whistles to me, because you're dealing with something that's like very plainly connected to, left and Marxist analysis in a very explicit way, So kind of bridging off of that, I really wanted to talk to you briefly about what's been going on lately in Chicago. We saw the murder of Adam Toledo, Lori Lightfoot. Oh, what a mess. But she's been flagrantly, I don't know, just blatantly inept and perhaps maybe not inept. I should say that she's been a perfect agent of the state, of a state that's, highly carceral, racist, et cetera. So maybe she's doing her job really well by those standards. And it's unfortunate that, this is, it just feels like we're on some sort of loop, because I remember a few years ago, we were talking about another young man who was murdered by police and whose video was hidden from the public because of, fear of popular outrage, by another mayor in Chicago, infamously. And so I'm trying to figure out, why do we keep seeing Laquan McDonald's or Adam Toledo's? And despite all of the activism that's going on, I remember the movement to get Rahm Emanuel out and to change the DA. Like right now you all have Kim Foxx, if I'm not mistaken, right? That was a movement with Asada's daughters very much at the helm. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about Chicago politics, like what the hell is going on over there, and how are you as an activist and someone involved in organizing and whatnot, how are people embracing this and dealing with this struggle? And then furthermore, what has been the Chicago-based response on the ground to some of the recent revelations about BLM, at least the global network, having been co-opted rather clearly, and not really doing enough to support local Black Lives Matter and other organizations that are working toward, at the very basic level, a reform of the police, if not an abolition thereof, or abolishing thereof, I should say.
Yeah. I think, for better or for worse, we're going to keep on saying, the things that Lori Lightfoot does until we, build enough strong enough organization and movement on the ground, and us being committed to building real electoral majorities and then masses when it comes to protests, so not just having a cadre, small grouped organizations. I think, and wins and losses kind of ebbs and flows, and so I think, what we're seeing with Lori is obviously it's to be expected. I mean, she's a prosecutor. She was the person who, that we were fighting against when it came to accountability for Rekia Boyd, and she was in the way of that process. Didn't do really any sort of accountability for the police officer, even, liberal accountability, So, I mean, I'm not necessarily surprised by it. I think what's lacking still is a commitment so I think the socialist aldermen are fairly good in terms of their commitment to defund and their commitment to, I think more on like the radical side, like of police accountability and civilian review board. Even though I don't believe in them, but that does have like a genuine Black radical legacy that comes out of CPAC, and so you see that commitment from those folks. I think the lack of commitment has come in is I think still from progressive labor. In Chicago is just really dependent on labor. So if Chicago Teachers Union at the SEIU locals don't really get behind it and don't fight for it as they do other issues or whatever, then it's more likely not to happen. So, and that's what's happening here in Chicago. And so, we just need that. We need those folks to keep the same energy they have at bargaining time, or let's say like raising the minimum wage or any other issue. We need that same energy for defund the police and and alternatives to policing and investment in our communities, because it's just it's not there. I mean, on the ground, folks are still, obviously, they're still organizing, they're still protesting, they're still confronting aldermen, they're still meeting with aldermen who are sympathetic, they're still, organizing transformative justice and restorative justice hubs. They're still doing violence interrupter programs, mutual aid, right? Folks are still doing all those things and are committed to like widening our base. I think right now, we noticed, at least for the Defund CPD campaign in Chicago, that like it was a lot of white folks, it was not enough young Black folks, and then also not enough, elderly Black folks too. So then that's really our focus in terms of like getting into Black churches, getting into like Black block clubs, and trying to like, really explain why defund matters, why defund would work, and why they should get behind defund, and the idea is that, sometimes people are like, oh, do these folks have to be abolitionists or not? Again, no, they don't. And a lot of times they're not, they just know that you're repping, but you're there to work with them on the terms that as long as it's like not enabling more police power and enabling more police in our community. So I know that's kind of like more of the boring end of like the organizing stuff, but yeah, I mean, we really, hopefully, we'll have someone who runs as mayor who's not someone like Lori Lightfoot, in terms of who's more radical and who's more principled, as like even if they're progressive, and then we got to be committed to a level of planned mass disruption like we saw last summer. That was spontaneous, but we need planned mass disruption in that same way. I think sometimes people forget when they look at Birmingham or Selma, right? Those are like planned mass disruption events that took on like months at a time, and we need to like have that same kind of energy, and that really sets the tone for if, politicians, and not just politicians, but like the capitalists behind them, like the people who fund police foundations, the people who fund people like Lori Lightfoot, that's what compels them to like bend the knee and like succumb to our will instead of doing their will. So, I'm optimistic that we can get close to those conditions this summer. Obviously I'm organizing for that. All my comrades are organizing for that. But that's what's going to be needed, right? You can't door knock your way to defunding the police. You can't like out theoretical or out propagandize your way to defund the police. You have to have enough street protests and enough action on the street to really make it felt that people feel like they need to succumb to your will, and so that's what's going to be the focus, and hopefully we can get there. And if we don't get there, we'll learn and figure out how to do better, so.
Yeah, I had one quick question, or I guess it's not, the answer may not be quick, but the question is quick.
Sorry, if I answer too long to tell me like, yo, brother, like, yeah. Sorry.
No, we love that. I mean, like, that's what you're here for, right? You're our guest, so we want to hear from you. Yeah, but after that, Richard, feel free to ask away. So I'm curious then, and it's something that I've long kind of, not long, but I guess recently grappled with, this idea of the progressive prosecutor, right? And that's why I raised Kim Fox.
Yeah, Kim.
Huh?
Yeah, Kim. Yeah, I forgot about Kim. Yeah.
No worries. But I think that it's something that we've seen in Philly with Larry Krasner, Kim Fox. I know there's some others, like Chesa Boudin in California. And I know that they've been doing good work. That's why I know that some issues have come up with Krasner and whatnot. But I guess for me, what I've always grappled with and tried to understand, much like, a similar question on like, what do we do when police commit a crime? If we're thinking about it as abolitionists, right? Like, where do we fit police or people who cause direct harm in the communities that we support, right? What do we do with that sort of contradiction? And so one of the contradictions for me that's always come up is like, what is a progressive prosecutor? Does it exist, right? Because it's almost like saying, like a good police officer, right? And for me, I understand that there can be maybe good police officers, but the issue isn't so much changing out the individuals, but changing the system. So where does the idea of a progressive prosecutor fit, if at all, in a larger abolition framework, as opposed to one that's just reformist? And if you could talk a bit about that, and then Richard, feel free to take over from there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think progressive prosecutors fall into abolition work. I think for sure it falls into decarceral work, right, or maybe defund work. But yeah, I don't think there's anything abolitionist about a prosecutor. With that said, like, I don't think, I sometimes think that we call too many things cops or police-like things. So I don't think a prosecutor is directly what a cop is, and even what a cop is allowed to do by, like by law and judicial, expectations, right? So there's like all these different types of powers that our police are allowed. Actually, to technically police power is allowed to be unlimited and undefined for that specific reason, unlike a prosecutor, which has like different types of curtailing things within it. But that's probably getting too into the weeds. But anyways, so, but yeah, I just don't think they're, to me, it's not abolition. I still think it's important to like have a strategy around making sure you get progressive prosecutors like into office, right, and into and making sure that they're actually progressive, But if that's my only issue is like when that's presented as like the solution or the prime solution, and isn't presented as this could go also really bad, like not really bad, but bad, like how Kasner's case, in terms of like actually expanding the purview and the role of the prosecutor's office then, and funding it more, right? It might not be to directly carceral things, it might be more restorative things, but those things should still not be in someone like Kasner's office. It should be in a public health department or another department that's completely not carceral at all. So, I mean, I think, I think having Kim Foxx here has helped definitely when it comes to like things like protests and jail support, and like, I think that it does help, right? It is important that you have that. And you can even see by the reaction of a certain element of the capitalist class in the city of Chicago that we're trying to get Kim Foxx out, right? Like it is, and you had private equity firms like dumping in tons, like millions of dollars into her opposition, right? So it does mean something, right? But I just think it's just important to set expectations of like, hey, this is progressive. This can fall into like really liberal or reactionary things, and then this is like the radical option, right? And the radical option is like making sure we have a fully funded public defender's department, right? Making sure we have, there's all these other different types of demands and focuses that you should have in order to make sure you truly have, the type of change that we want to see. And then on the abolitionist level, of course, then there's a whole, I think the abolitionist level still, again, the difference between like, let's say abolition, let's say decarceration. So like, what's the difference between like Ruth Gilmore and Michelle Alexander is that, the decarceral kind of progressive reform thing will try to, so not liberal reform, but progressive reform will try to make it about, well, we got to focus on the prosecutors. We got to focus on kind of like the architecture around the police itself. Whereas abolition still says, it still always says we have to transform society. So we have to like move from a capitalist society to like some form of socialism or anarchism or communism. And then also on top of that, though, it says that your object has to be the police and the prison and systems of control and surveillance, right? Like that has to be your object in terms of what you're going after and the power that you're trying to reduce, not just the architecture around it that keeps it in place,
Earlier, you mentioned how organized labor played a kind of important role in the organizational and political kind of framework in Chicago. And I know Chicago is one of the places in the country where organized labor is still relatively strong comparatively to other places, like particularly in the South and elsewhere in the country. And so you also mentioned that it was sometimes they weren't as rapid to get on some of the more radical kind of things that you find yourself politically involved with. And I was wondering, is that something where the kind of the overlap in the DSA membership and labor organizing membership, and particularly in the whiteness, where there could be some sort of a pressure applied that way? Is that something that's going on or that you could speak to at all?
Yeah, what's interesting is like usually some of the loudest, like especially the white voices, the loudest about labor or whatever, like they've never organized in Labor Day in their life. So it's always kind of like cosplaying, like they're like these like huge pro labor folks, whatever. But it's like it's an idealist sense, not an actual day to day sense. Similar to I think sometimes people like valorize the Black church, but then like haven't gone through the actual all the different things that come with that. So. But for sure, yeah, the DSA, we do have strategies around that. Sometimes it gets applied. And yeah, it gets applied, but it's not coherent enough yet. DSA, I mean, we're just honestly just not powerful enough yet to like really, I think, impact those changes in the way that we want. And I think also, DSA, we still I think rightfully at times are pointed at that it's still, it's a white majority organization that, and for the most part, we have no right to tell, people of color, Black and brown majority organizations like the Chicago Teachers Union, like most SEIU locals, right? What to do or how to do it, and so I think that's usually the struggle that we have. And usually the folks that are putting the pressure on is like, like I'm part of the Defund CPD campaign, which was started by the Black Abolitionist Network. So, the pressure is usually put on through those kind of folks. And at times they're responsive, but, not responsive probably in the ways that I think that they need to be. And they know where they stand. And obviously I'm still comrades and friends with them, and, hopefully we can move their membership and have a chance to build with their membership. Like they're definitely open with us doing teachings there, and we've done teachings with them. And so we just got to keep on doing it. But yeah, I wouldn't, no shade to DSA. Obviously that's my organization, but yeah, I wouldn't oversell that aspect of what we do. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I think a lot of people are struggling with, trying to find some sort of balance between their ideological and theoretical kind of understandings that they've been developing, and then how that applies and how to apply it to the organizational and the direct action work, and kind of finding a balance between those. And I think the material conditions in the ground in Chicago are different than what they might be in Atlanta, which are different than what they might be in Seattle or Tacoma or in LA, and so on and so forth. And so like, yeah. I feel that information and understanding about those, and then having the organizational frameworks, is incredibly helpful. So like, I am very appreciative towards DSA towards that. But you also mentioned, and Wendy as well, about kind of going into DSA spaces, and it was a predominantly white space. In my case, the only other person of color that I saw was somebody that brought in, like, was carrying things and didn't actually stay for the meeting. And so like, it was a very it was very uncomfortable experience. It was like, okay, so I see a Black person doing work and they're not even a part of this meeting. Right. And this is in the Blackest city in the state that I live in. And so like, it was just very jarring experience. And so like, knowing about AfroSoc, and so like, is for me, it's like, okay, there is this space, there is this work going on. It's like, that's something that I could see involvement in. But I also see the kind of frustrations and hurdles and barriers that you get, that AfroSoc and Black people in DSA generally bump up against, and see those frustrations and want to see outside of that. But you also mentioned the large membership of DSA comparatively to some of the other organizational work that you've done, but also that it's still relatively small as an organizational power comparatively to some of the opposition that it faces in the grand scheme. And so I think working through and doing the work and building is an important part of that. And I think it's what you've described so far, is that it's work, and it's not always enjoyable, and that there's, it's work, but it has to get done.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, and touching on that, like BLM Global Network thing, it's like, because our BLM chapter, who a lot of, Aisla and Amika, those are my homies, who like literally built out the BLM Shy chapter from scratch, and they signed on to the letter being like, hey, you need to be funding us the right way, and like, what's going on with it. And this has been like years and years kind of fight is, obviously Black folks fight amongst themselves too, and we have our own drama or whatever, and like it's ideological. Some of the times it's principled. Some of it is going against like grifter stuff, and so, you're gonna have the fight one way or the other. Sometimes it's gonna be with your folks. Sometimes it's gonna be with obviously white folks or non-Black folks. So it's just kind of depending on what kind of fight you want to have and in the terrain of it that you want to have. Like, I know for myself, for AFROSOC and DSA, like, I never have to worry about, $90 million coming in. Where does it go? Because we don't have funders and we're dues supported. Obviously, you got to care about what the dues are, but the dues are like so low and the amount of money is so low that, we truly have an organization where, the membership runs it, not the staff and not like whoever, like, Chapo Trap House don't run DSA, and the biggest media folks don't run it or don't whatever. They might be getting their bag somehow else, but they're not getting it off of like the work that we're doing on the ground. And so, and I think for myself, that was, after the experiences, which is like, the Black Lives Matter movement in general, I was definitely always going to be invested in doing, Black-led organizing and Black organizing, and I still do, but I just want to do it in a way where, that was always democratic and members, and it was democratically controlled. And even in my time in labor, I learned that too, was just that because, a lot of people, especially on the DSA side, will like romanticize what labor unions are. And I believe in labor unions, right? I believe everyone should have a right to a union. And I'm a union person till like the day I die. Like I even have I'm getting a union car, like, but we shouldn't romanticize it, like we shouldn't ignore what Jerome was fighting about, like we should understand that they're very bureaucratic and undemocratic spaces too, and so, I just didn't want that in my organizing no more. It doesn't mean I didn't want the political fights. I knew the fights were going to be there. I knew the drama was going to be there, but I just wanted it to know that like, hey, if your side won that fight and won that argument for whatever, then I know it happened straight up. And it was what it was, and it wasn't involved in no grifting. It wasn't involved in no personality thing or whatever. It was just, you won that political fight. You won a strategic fight. I need to take the L and then just move on with the organization, Whereas the other stuff that was happening before, it would just get either so escalated on some grifting stuff, or it just would get so escalated on some like, kind of like what I would feel like is like the Black Panther BLA breakup, which was like, who's more radical or who's having the right political line of when we should do A, B, or C, and like a lot of that stuff would happen too with like the anti-electoral folks or the pro-electoral folks or like the mutual aid folks versus the direct action folks. And it was just like, these are stupid, at least for me, these are stupid fights, like we need to be figuring out how to do it all, but just within a context, and, and I'm just glad I don't have to deal with that anymore, nowadays. Not saying it's all kumbaya or whatever, but yeah.
I think the idea of an integrated and multi-pronged approach, and that involves a variety and possibly all of the kind of ideas about how to go about it, but around a centering goal is a good kind of vision that I'm picking up out of what you're saying, and so I'm very appreciative of that.
Thanks, man. Yeah, and AfroSoc, we're always, we'd love to have y'all. So, so whenever.
I'm trying. I hear, it's just like every time I see or hear something, I'm just like but like I need to be more involved in direct organizing, and that's one of the things I wanted to do. Coronavirus has kind of put somewhat of a hiatus on that in general, but like that's something I'm personally working on. So like if you're making it an appealing space, sound appealing. So like you're doing good by them.
Thank you.
For me, like it's always been a matter of, Richard and I actually talk about this all the time, but, like getting really close to joining an organization, but then seeing some stuff that kind of makes me second guess or like feel kind of weird some way, you know what I'm saying? Like I get kind of, So for me, what I've found most valuable, because I'm like too much of a hater or critical, is I have a tendency to, I think of like, support the groups in the way that you can and don't stand in the way, right? Especially of the work that they're doing that's toward liberation. You can criticize and you can be, like, as I said, feel some kind of way about what they're doing or things that you may disagree with or angles or that they take that you don't like. But at the end of the day, recognizing that they're fighting for your liberation and mine, and that, we can support them even if from the side. I do think people should join organizations, though, that they feel best suit their ideological needs or direction that they're going in. And I'm not one of the people who's like, don't join an organization. I think that's silly. But your mentioning of the BLA, the Black Liberation Army, just now reminded me of my final question. And it's a weird segue that I'm about to make, but trust me, it makes sense. So earlier today, actually, I was talking to my mother, and she had seen an interview that I did recently on Red Life podcast, where I talked about communism and like identifying that way. And my mother was like, my mother, by the way, who grew up in like the height of the Cold War and whatnot, like, she's like, you're a communist? You're like, what? Can you tell me a little bit what that means, right? Because, and then she started talking about sort of like popular media representations of Cuba and all of these things, and how she was deterred from further exploring that political ideology because of what she had seen in quote unquote communist countries through the US media, right? And my mother is American, so like her whole life she's been, influenced by US mainstream media and history. And so I was breaking down to her all this stuff, and then it clicked, like, oh, she knows communists. Like, she, I like I literally like laid out like 500 years of Cuban history, right? And then she mentioned, it's like the Black Panthers, because the media lied about them too. And I was like, right. Like she was exposed to this. She knows. And then she started talking about Angela Davis. And I said, Angela Davis is a communist too. And I know you like her, right? So there was like I don't know, there was this interesting moment where I think some things clicked for my mom, who's in her 60s. And that really was like a pivotal moment for me as her child, And so what I was thinking about when she mentioned the reason BLA fits is because she mentioned Angela Davis and Black Panthers and BLA and stuff like that. And I said, I thought to myself, at least, what are the ways that people like you can reach out to people and encourage them and further educate them, or I guess engage in an act of mutual education, actually, about what abolition means, what the sort of historical trajectory of that kind of work has been. And I think specifically of Angela Davis, because I know she is an abolitionist, right? At least I know she was involved in George Jackson's trial and things like that. And you mentioned him as well. So I was wondering if you could just talk briefly about the history, from your point of view. I know you talked about your entree into it, but if you could talk about its actual history of what you know of it, since this is a history podcast. And then also maybe what are some readings or, talks or something that you would suggest for people to check out, especially if they're unfamiliar with this sort of ideology, where you think that should go?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I think when it comes to books, well, I mean, there's always like kind of two trajectories, right? There is the like more recent moment of abolition, right, as it relates to police and prisons, right? That gets like articulated like in the early 70s, and then there's of course abolition. Abolition in relation to slavery, right, and to the global anti-Black slave trade, and I think the book The Slave's Cause really explains and traces how it is a radical political tradition that really it's the first quintessential American radical political tradition. I would actually make an argument similar to what Brendan McQuaid makes, that it precedes socialism, right? That it is a radical tradition that precedes kind of like all these kind of Eurocentric ones that we start hearing about. Well, they're told in Eurocentric ways when we're talking about socialism, communism, so I think there's that part. Some people periodize it at different times. For myself, I started at like the emergence of Haiti as the first and only free abolitionist anti-colonial project, and then what we understand to be the Underground Railroad, the general strike of Black slaves, and then of course like Maroonage communities, and then of course like fugitive acts of against masters and against slave institutions, like for example even thinking of like Nat Turner, and I think for then like for the kind of current moment of what abolition is and how we get to that moment. And obviously that moment, some people like Gary Dorian kind of keep pushing it. I think he has a book called like The New Abolitionist or something Abolitionist. And then he connects then what became the Black social gospel to then what abolition was and the continuation of it. So then the project of like how Reconstruction got built, how people understood what Reconstruction was, and the making of what Du Bois calls an abolition democracy, but then also after what happens with Jim Crow, understanding how to, and then this is where it gets more strongly connected to labor, socialism, and other radical politics. But even before then, when it was like, during the time when we had formal slavery, there was always the connections to labor parties and labor organizing, and other radical currents going on in anti-colonial organizing from Native American folks. And then, you get traces of it. You start seeing the reemergence of ideas around abolition in response to then like people like Bayard Rustin and especially other Black folks, but other white folks too, who were starting to get imprisoned due to being drafted. They didn't want to do the World War II draft, so then they would, protest it, be against it, and then they'd be in prison. And you start getting this understanding that prison isn't just this thing that goes after criminals or quote unquote bad people, or isn't just for crime control, but it's to really control and curtail leftist and radical political activity. And then with the emergence of the Black Freedom Movement, of course, and Dan Berger, and Toussaint really make this argument that, as you saw folks adopting the jail-in strategy for the Black Freedom Movement, you started seeing the prison become folded back into the open, like into the mainstream, the prison and the jail back into the mainstream as the site of that curtails democracy and is fundamentally an anti-democratic space, just as like the workplace once was, like at the height of labor struggles, and then, of course you get what, King's letter from a Birmingham jail to that's like paradigmatic of this. And then from there you build out from the prisoner organizing going on and explicitly anti-abolition politics, that says that like, if you care about racial justice, like radical racial justice, if you care about radical economic justice in the terms of like socialism, communism, anarchism, those kind of things, then you have to deal with and confront the prison, and then you have to deal with and confront the police state. And so then throughout the 70s, you start getting actual organizing to abolish prisons and police. And this is before the mass incarceration, like thing, this is like when there was only maybe 300,000, folks locked up. And so then, you get the rise of community organizations, fighting for forms of direct abolition. And then and this is something that, a lot of like, the class reductionist left, you would say, or like the anti-abolition or defund left would not want to admit that even in the Scandinavian countries, you had abolition movements and abolition organizing, that because people love to praise like the social democratic, like their, like the Scandinavian countries for their thing, but those type of social control institutions and police institutions come directly out of an abolition movement that had to happen. And then that's like what the compromise was. It had nothing to do with like social democracy, because there's plenty of social democracy places that have, far more carceral systems and far more heavily policed things also. And even for Angela Davis, she speaks to like being influenced by seeing what was going on there. And then, I think the next big upsurge is, it's in conjunction with seeing like a lot the prison boom going on within like, regional, like in like more what I guess you'd call like farm areas or non-urban areas, and then people starting to do organizing against those prisons. But then the real kind of paradigmatic moment of like the emergence of like abolition proper as like, this is the political tradition, this is what we're organizing on, this is what we're building on, then comes out of critical resistance, like the making of critical resistance, with with Gilmore, Joy James, Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, and you can go down the list and actual, political prisoners who are locked up and folks who are locked up also. And that's when you start seeing the emergence of what we understand debate today, like abolition organizing. And you kind of get to this moment. I mean, you saw it in strands with like Black Lives Matter, with Dream Defenders, with BYP 100. But, at least for me, I feel like the time when it's been most legible and understood, and that someone like my mom knows it or everybody knows it, it was with the defund moment. Like, it wasn't, people weren't, even before defund, no one in my family was, my sister's going to a Mariame Kaba book study now, she wasn't doing,
that's amazing.
She wasn't doing it. She was reading Black Lives Matter related stuff before this moment. Right. But, she wasn't, even some of her rhetoric or content, like it wasn't, she was obviously very critical of police but she was far more in like the, more in the policing is bad and, we need to curb it as much as possible, but not like on the abolition side of things, and I'm not saying she is an abolitionist, but in terms of just understanding it and that it's a thing to respond to and that it's the thing to like kind of orient yourself around. I do feel like that's what defund is. And that's like the demarcation. I think in some ways it kind of has saved, like, and by us, I mean, like, just like our larger movement of, whether it's like Black movement or abolition movement, I think it kind of saved us from kind of like, all the fuck shit that's going on with like, Black Lives Matter Global Network and all that kind of stuff. So, I'm definitely grateful for that. And I believe it's a good politic. I believe it's, it's always my primary radical tradition before even socialism or anything else, identify with all those things, but, I'm birthed through, revolutionary third world Marxism and then, abolition, so.
You mentioned at the top that a lot of kind of your what brought you here was learning and understanding things through political prisoners. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how the political prisoners and organizing on their behalf and in solidarity with them and towards their freedom has both influenced you, like you personally, and then also your organizing.
Yeah, I mean, my first organizing actual project, I mean, it was like a fundraiser for the Angola 3, and it was connected to one of the people at ACLU had been working on their thing, and one of the brothers had gotten out, and finally had gotten out. So that was, my first initial connection, and then connected to then, Fred Hampton Jr. when he got out, and luckily I was able to do like a whole car ride with him from Madison to Chicago. Building on that. And then it was the Puerto Rican political prisoners trying to get everyone out, and most folks got out at that time except for Oscar, because he just he didn't want it. It was there was terms of the things that he didn't want to say yes to, and in a very principled way. So I had to like respect that and understand that. And so I think that, I think all that work just always allowed me to understand that. I think before that moment, I just had always understood, prisons, and, it was kind of like that thing of like, oh, it doesn't rehabilitate people. Oh, it doesn't, but I think at that moment, then I understood it as like fundamentally like this, like, anti-radical, anti-leftist project that's meant to like curtail our movements. And then, the work around the George Birch torture survivors just then also allowed me just to understand that at some level, right, like everyone who's locked up are at some level like political prisoners, and that they're made the conditions that folks are forced into prison and to jail. I don't want to say like like automatically like creates political conditions, but like, I mean, yeah, they're fundamentally unjust, but it just, I guess sometimes just certain things are unexplainable, but yeah, I mean, the John Birch stuff is just, it kind of falls into like then the Frank, the John Birch stuff is like that moment where when then you're reading someone like Frank Wilderson, you're like, oh, that makes sense then, because it's so the level of torture those folks faced for at least with the Black Panthers, at least with George Jackson, at least with Puerto Rican political prisoners, at least with the Angola 3, you can be like, oh, these folks was out here getting it. These folks were going against the state. They were, doing woo-wops to bam, and then like it gives it a kind of reasoning and a logic, like, oh, that's what happens. But, the John Birch stuff was very much, the line that Frank kind of says is that like, when you see violence happens to Black folks, and there was Latino folks though too who were tortured by John Birch, but it was majority Black folks, is that sometimes there's no logic. Like these weren't like, these weren't big kingpins. They weren't big political people. They weren't nobody. These were just like literally like just like Black bodies and Latinx bodies that just wanted to torture for the sake of it, And and I think that kind of work and even once you got these folks out, because you never want to say free at times. Sometimes I slip into that, but they're never quite free because the repair isn't there, the actual necessary apology isn't there, the apology plus like the all the things that go into an amends isn't there too, and so I think just like all that stuff combined is kind of it's just like some people say it's working how it's supposed to work. Some people say whatever, right? But it's just like that this project, the police, prison, and surveillance state is beyond any sort of transformation or repair or anything like that, And so, at least for myself, I guess at times there's, I think, an analytical thing, but it's less of an analytical thing. It's just more of a just like a sadness and depression and just kind of like what the fuck. And so, but then also just like a focus of like, this is the thing you need to focus on first and foremost, because it's just, it's not all right. Like when it gets so, people use that word a lot of times, normalized. I don't think it even gets normalized. It's just like, Angola is a slave plantation, like it's literally, like it's like, and, once you kind of sit in that horror, and people are just still doing what they do on Angola, it's just unreal. So, I guess at some level, maybe I want to pretend it's an analytical connection, but it's more of like an emotional, spiritual connection in terms of why this work matters and, why we have to keep fighting. So.
I think that that's very meaningful and important words, and I greatly appreciate your time and you sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. And I do have to get going, so this will be my last words, but I just again want to express my sincerest thanks for your contributions.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, fam.
Thanks, Richard. See you later.
Till next time.
I just wanted to, again, I'll echo what Richard said in terms of thanking you for being our guest. And I also think several of the writers that you mentioned, they're people that I've been getting into as well. Not so much the reading, just because I haven't had a chance to read anything because I always have a baby that I have to take care of. No, she's a toddler now, but you get what I'm saying. Same thing. Yeah. But like that, just listening to them speak and understanding things really helps a lot because they're so clear. That's one of the things I very much appreciate about a lot of people involved in the abolitionist movement in the U.S. is that there's so much clarity in their words. There's so much urgency. And as I said, I really appreciate that like anyone can come into this and learn. And I think that's what makes it even more bankrupt when people are like, what does this all mean? I don't know, like being very disingenuous about it when they're very clear and prevalent, well,
it's just like, just be like you like cops then, or like you like jail, like just
right.
do that. Like, some people do that. Like Amber LaFrost at least says like, no, I want these people in jail. It's like, all right, cool. Like, that's where you're at. I don't agree with it, right? But other people just do this whole song and dance, and it's just like, okay, like it's just not your jam. Right.
Yeah, just say that you have garbage politics and go, or that you hate Black people and go.
Right. Right. Like I don't. Yeah, like the other part is just like, if Defund was coming from like the like majority white leftist socialist audience, like, it would be, it would definitely have a different reaction to
for
that.
sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
As you said, like there are, if you look at the leaders of the so much of the abolitionist work that's going on right now, the most prevalent people are, Black women.
Yes.
That stands out to me, because all the people you can name like are Black women, right? And so it's just fitting that they have this kind of visceral reaction to their words and their work, and also actively try to obfuscate or like make it seem less easy to understand, or make these concepts seem so difficult when they're speaking plain English and very openly and clearly. And, it's something that a lot of us go through, just anyone engaged in this stuff as a person of color, but especially as women of color. As a woman of color myself, as a Black woman, it's something that I deal with all the time, where I have to sit there and watch my very clear words get quote unquote translated for me by white leftists, and especially white leftist men. But yeah, so anyway, much appreciated. I think this work is, as I said, timely, important, always important, but I think the urgency is, I don't know, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I feel like a lot of things are coming to a head, and especially when we have, a verdict being read and more Black people being killed like at that same moment. It's just, it's so apparent that something needs to change. And I think that a lot of people who maybe weren't so interested or focused on these issues are starting to recognize that something is wrong. And I think that those kinds of moments, much like we saw with, chattel slavery in the past, even if some of the allies, quote unquote allies involved in the movement, don't have the most clear or even helpful politics sometimes, you still feel from them that they recognize that something is wrong. Their motivation may be different than ours, but they recognize that there's a problem. So hopefully that will help along the way, Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, that's the, it was, I think that moment, especially with, when Brian's murder happened, that was tough. But I think at the same time I was just like, this is this is a devil's playground, but it's still God's universe, and that like we whatever the message is and whatever the thing is that we need to build from it, that we hopefully we can, but it was tough. It was really tough. So especially, I have a daughter, so it was just, it was kind of out of control for me. So,
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much, Jasson, for joining us, I should say. I look forward to sharing your work that you've written, and I hope that you write more. It's very important. Obviously, people can follow you on Twitter. We'll include all of that information in the show notes, how you can get in touch with him, how you can read his work, and also some links with regard to abolition, ending prisons, ending policing as we know it, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you so much again. Much appreciated. And take care of yourself and your family.
Yes, you too.
Thanks. And thank you for listening. Once again, be sure to check us out on social media by following @LeftPOC, and that's LEFTPOC, and to check out our Patreon, where everything is always free, transparent, and open to the public, by going to patreon.com/LeftPOC, where you can also donate $1 or more per month. Wow, that's really hard to say. $1 or more per month. Try to say that 10 times over very quickly. Or even one time, like if you're me, and continue to mess it up. Anyway, thanks so much everyone for listening. Be safe and have a good one.